The estate had gone silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence that settles over a grand mansion when the world goes to sleep, but the terrible, suffocating kind that fills a house when something irreplaceable has vanished from it. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The kind that a father recognizes in his bones before his mind even catches up to what his heart already knows. Lucas Hartwell, 35 years old, worth $4 billion, a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had survived boardroom wars and hostile takeovers and the kind of ruthlessness that the business world demands, stood in the middle of his son's empty bedroom, and he was completely, utterly destroyed. The crib was empty. The small stuffed elephant that Oliver always clutched in his sleep lay abandoned on the floor beside it, as if it had been knocked loose when tiny hands had reached for something no one could see. Because Oliver couldn't see anything. Oliver Hartwell was 2 years old, and he had been blind since birth. Outside, the security team was already flooding the grounds with flashlights. 12 men, professional, trained, armed, sweeping every corner of the 3-acre property. Cameras were being reviewed. Gates were being checked. Phone calls were being made to people who made other phone calls. And none of it mattered, because in a house full of power and money and everything that wealth could buy, nobody could find a 2-year-old boy who couldn't see, who couldn't call out for help the way other children could, who navigated the world entirely by sound and touch and the familiar smell of the people who loved him. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. And in the small servants' quarters at the back of the estate, a 3-year-old girl named Rosie was already awake. She was already thinking. She was already reaching for something that no one else in that house would have thought to use. What happened next, in the hours between midnight and dawn, would be talked about for the rest of their lives. Before we go any further into the story, I need to stop for just a moment because this one is special. This story isn't just about a missing child or a wealthy family or a little girl with an extraordinary heart. This story is about something that money cannot buy and power cannot manufacture. Something that lives quietly in the smallest, most overlooked people in the room. And I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in the United States, maybe curled up on your couch late at night, just needing something that reminds you the world still has goodness in it? Are you watching from the United Kingdom, perhaps with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside you? Maybe you're in Canada or Australia, scrolling through your phone while the rest of your house sleeps. Could be India, where stories of innocent children touch the soul in a way nothing else can. Or perhaps Germany, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere across this wide, complicated world where a parent's fear of losing their child is the most universal language there is. Wherever you are, drop your country in the comments. Tell me you're here, because the story I'm about to tell you deserves witnesses. It deserves people who will carry it forward. Now, let's go back to that estate. Back to the empty crib. Back to the little girl with the plan that nobody expected. To understand what made that night so dangerous, you first have to understand Oliver. Oliver Hartwell had come into the world on a Tuesday morning in late September, and Lucas had been in the delivery room, which was something people who knew Lucas Hartwell professionally would have found surprising. Lucas was not considered a soft man. He was not the kind of man who showed up for tender moments. He had built his fortune in technology infrastructure, the unglamorous, invisible backbone of the digital world, and he had done it by being harder and faster and more relentless than everyone around him. His name appeared in financial magazines. His face had graced the cover of Forbes. His ex-wife, Diane, had left him when Oliver was 4 months old, citing, among other things, the fact that Lucas was more emotionally available to his servers than to his family. She had not been entirely wrong. But when Oliver was born, something happened to Lucas that no business school had prepared him for and no acquisition strategy could have anticipated. He fell completely in love. Not the complicated, conditional love that adults offer each other with all its negotiations and disappointments, but the immediate, total, devastating love that a parent feels when they first hold their child and understand, for the first time, that there is now something in the world more important than themselves. He held Oliver in the delivery room, and Oliver was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a nose like a button, and a serious expression that Lucas recognized as his own. The diagnosis came 6 weeks later. Congenital blindness, a condition present from birth, affecting both eyes, irreversible with current medical technology. Lucas had flown in 3 specialists from different countries. He had funded a research initiative. He had done everything that money could do. And then he had come home, sat alone in his study, and stayed there for a very long time. Because there was nothing money could do about the darkness his son lived in. What money could do, and what Lucas threw himself into with the same ferocity he had once reserved for market domination, was make sure that Oliver's world was safe. Every corner of the estate was designed for him. The furniture had soft edges and specific textures, so Oliver could map the rooms by touch. Every caregiver who worked in the house was trained in approaches that supported blind children. Music played softly in different rooms so Oliver could orient himself by sound. The whole estate, 3 acres and 14,000 square feet of it, had been quietly, methodically redesigned around the navigation needs of a 2-year-old who could not see. It had taken 8 months and cost a small fortune, and Lucas had supervised every detail personally. Oliver had learned to move through that space like a tiny, confident sailor reading the currents of a familiar sea. He knew where the kitchen was by the smell of it. He knew the drawing room by the way the hardwood floors gave way to Persian carpet under his feet. He knew his father's study by the particular hum of the computer equipment and the faint, lingering scent of the coffee that Lucas drank too much of. He knew his bedroom by everything. By the softness of his specific blanket, by the sound of the white noise machine in the corner, by the smell of the baby lotion his nanny used every night after his bath. He knew his world completely. But outside his world, outside the carefully controlled, lovingly engineered environment that had been built around his limitations, Oliver knew nothing. Outside was chaos. Outside was unpredictable. Outside was a 3-acre property in the dark, full of uneven ground and a pond and hedgerows and gates and all the 100 hazards of a world that had not been designed for him. Outside, Oliver was completely lost. And that was where he was. Nobody knew how he had gotten there. The crib had safety rails. The bedroom door had a child lock on the inside handle. The windows were secured. The motion sensors in the hallway should have alerted the night security the moment the bedroom door opened. Somehow, none of it had worked. Somehow, Oliver was gone. Lucas stood in that empty bedroom and felt something crack open in the center of him that he did not have a name for. He was a man who solved problems. He was a man who looked at a broken system and fixed it. He was a man who did not accept impossible outcomes. But his son was 2 years old and blind and somewhere out there in the dark, and for the first time in his adult life, Lucas Hartwell did not know what to do. He pressed his back against the wall and slid down it until he was sitting on the floor beside the empty crib, and he put his face in his hands. Down the hall, behind the door that separated the servants' quarters from the main house, a little girl named Rosie heard the commotion. She had been almost asleep, tucked against her mother's side, her small overnight bag already packed because tomorrow they were going home. Her mother, Elena, had worked at the Hartwell estate for 2 years as head of housekeeping, and tomorrow was the end of her contract. Rosie had spent enough evenings at this estate to know its sounds. She knew the sound of the security team. She knew the sound of adults moving fast and speaking in low, urgent voices that they used when they did not want children to hear them. She sat up in the dark. She listened, and then she climbed out of bed and went to find her small blue bear. Rosie was 3 years old and 4 months, which she considered very important. The 4 months part especially, because 3 and 4 months was meaningfully different from just barely three, a distinction that adults rarely appreciated, but that Rosie held firmly. She had her mother's dark eyes and her late father's stubborn jaw, and she had opinions about everything. The right way to fold napkins into swans always, the correct number of stories before bed, 3 minimum, and the fundamental injustice of vegetables appearing on the same plate as foods you actually wanted to eat. She was small for her age, slight and quick, with the kind of energy that adults describe as a lot in a tone that is meant to sound neutral but doesn't. She asked questions constantly. She noticed things. She remembered everything. She had been coming to the Hartwell estate with her mother for almost the entirety of her conscious life, which meant she knew this place the way children know places, not as a collection of rooms and corridors and square footage, but as a living geography of moments. The kitchen was where Cook Maria sometimes gave her a piece of fruit when her mother wasn't looking. The East Garden was where the butterflies came in summer. The long hallway outside the library was perfect for sock sliding, a fact she had established through extensive personal research. And Oliver's room, the room 2 doors down from the nursery, with the soft rug and the white noise machine, was where she had spent more afternoons than she could count, sitting on the floor beside a small boy who could not see her, talking to him about everything she saw. That had started almost accidentally. Rosie's mother had been working a long day, and Rosie had been bored, and she had wandered into Oliver's room where his nanny was giving him a supervised play session, and Rosie had simply started narrating. "That's a red block," she had told him, picking it up and pressing it into his hands. "Red is like when you stand too close to the fireplace and your face gets warm. That's what red feels like." The nanny had looked up, surprised. Oliver had turned the block over in his hands, and a slow smile had crossed his face. And that had been the beginning of something. Over the months that followed, Rosie had become Oliver's unofficial correspondent to the visible world. She described colors in terms of temperatures and textures. She told him that yellow was like the feeling right before you sneeze, bright and sharp and impossible to ignore. She told him that blue was the sound the house made in the early morning before anyone else was awake. She told him that green smelled like the garden after rain and tasted like the mint leaves Cook Maria kept on the windowsill. Oliver couldn't talk much yet. 2-year-olds rarely have the vocabulary for philosophy, but he listened with his entire body, turning toward her voice, his small face tilted up with an attention that Rosie found deeply satisfying. She had never once thought of their friendship as charity. She thought of it as conversation. And she had given him something else, too, something she had not told her mother about because she understood instinctively that adults would have opinions about it that would complicate things. 2 weeks ago, she had pressed her small blue bear into Oliver's hands. The bear was Rosie's most precious possession. It had belonged to her father, not as a toy, but as a small decorative bear that had sat on his desk, and after he died, when Rosie was barely 2, her mother had given it to Rosie and told her that Daddy had loved it, and now it was hers. The bear smelled like something Rosie couldn't name, but would have recognized anywhere. Faintly of wood and something sweet, an old smell, a permanent smell, the smell that had lived in the fabric for so long it had become part of it. And it was small and solid, and had a very particular texture, the worn plush of something that had been held many times, and Rosie could find it in the dark, in her sleep, in any room, because she always knew where it was the way you know where your own hand is. She had pressed it into Oliver's hands 2 weeks ago and said, "This is for when you're scared. You can hold it. It'll know where it is." She hadn't been sure he understood. But he had clutched it against his small chest and put his face against it, and the way he breathed in, slow and deep, as if he were memorizing something, told her that maybe he had understood more than she expected. Now, in the dark of her mother's small room at the back of the estate, Rosie stood by the door and listened to the sounds of the search. She reached into her overnight bag. She found the small pocket where she kept her most important things. The bear was not there. Of course it wasn't. She had given it to Oliver. And Oliver was missing. But here was the thing. Here was the thing that Rosie understood in her body before she understood it in her mind. The way children sometimes know things that they haven't been taught. She had always been able to find that bear. Always. In the dark, in a crowded room, in her sleep. She could feel where it was, the way you feel the direction of a sound, or the warmth of a light source, or the presence of someone standing close to you. She could not have explained this to an adult in a way they would have believed. But she knew it was true. She put on her shoes, very quietly, so her mother wouldn't wake. And she made a plan. The clock in the main hallway struck midnight as Rosie slipped through the connecting door between the servants' quarters and the east corridor of the main house. She was wearing her yellow pajamas with the ducks on them and her pink sneakers that lit up when she walked, which she recognized immediately as a problem. The lights would give her away. She stopped in the corridor, sat down on the floor and took the sneakers off. Held them in her hands. Thought about this. She put them back on. The lights were actually useful. Not for sneaking, but for something else. Oliver couldn't see, but he could feel. He could feel movement, air displacement, the subtle changes in an environment that sighted people never noticed because they were too busy using their eyes. The small flashing of her sneaker lights wouldn't help him, but the sound of her footsteps might. And she was going to need him to follow the sound of her if she found him. She adjusted her plan. She walked toward the sounds of the search. The main house was transformed. Lights blazed in every room. The security team had divided the property into a grid and were working through it systematically, but the grounds were large and the night was dark and a 2-year-old could fit into spaces that adults couldn't follow. 3 of the team were inside, checking rooms. 2 were at the gate. The others were in the garden. Lucas was in the security monitoring room, watching the camera feeds with his head of security, a severe man named Grayson who had served 2 tours overseas and managed crisis situations for a living, and who had, in the past 90 minutes, aged visibly. "We've covered the north garden, the garage, the pool house, and the east lawn," Grayson was saying, his finger moving across a map of the property. "We still have the south garden, the orchard, and the area around the pond." The pond. The word fell into the room like a stone. Lucas went very still. "Focus on the pond," he said. His voice was completely flat. The way voices go when emotion has been stripped away by something that is too large to hold in the body. Grayson spoke quietly into his radio. And Rosie, standing in the doorway of the corridor that led past the monitoring room, heard the word pond, and something in her chest pulled, not toward the pond, but away from it. A direction. A feeling. She turned left. The south garden. She had taken exactly 4 steps in that direction when a large hand landed on her shoulder, and she was lifted, gently but firmly, off her feet. "What are you doing out of bed?" It was Marcus, one of the security team, a wide-shouldered man with a kind face who had once shown Rosie how the cameras worked when she had asked. "I know where Oliver is," Rosie said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was a professional. He had a checklist. He had a grid to complete. He was also a father. "You know where Oliver is," he repeated. "I gave him my bear," Rosie said. "And I can feel where my bear is. It's that way." She pointed. "South garden. By the big stone thing." "The fountain?" "The big stone thing with water." Marcus held her for another moment, calculating. Then he spoke into his radio. "Team, I'm checking the fountain area in the south garden. Possible lead." He looked at Rosie. "You stay with me. Right next to me. You do not run ahead. Understood?" "Understood," Rosie said, in a tone that suggested she was accustomed to agreeing with adults while privately reserving her options. They moved through the house, through the glass doors into the south garden, and the night air hit Rosie like cold water, sharp and clean, smelling of grass and something floral she couldn't name. She walked beside Marcus. She followed the feeling. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't a smell, and it wasn't anything she could point to in her body except that it was real. It was there. It was a kind of certainty that sat in her chest like a compass needle swinging to true north. They passed the rose beds. They passed the stone path. They passed the iron bench where Rosie had once eaten a sandwich while watching a bee. And then, in the cone of Marcus's flashlight, in the curve of the stone fountain, the large, decorative fountain that had been turned off for the season, its basin dry, its surface a low bowl of shadow, they saw something small curled against the far edge. Oliver. He was sitting with his back against the stone, his knees pulled to his chest, his face tucked down. He was not crying. He was very, very still, the way frightened children sometimes go still when the world has become too large and too loud and too incomprehensible. In his hands, clutched against his small chest, was a blue bear. Marcus was on his radio in an instant. Found him. South Garden, the fountain. He's safe. He's safe. Then his voice broke, just slightly, on the next words. He's okay. And Rosie walked forward, slowly, the way she had learned to approach Oliver, without sudden movement, without surprise, and she crouched down at the edge of the fountain until she was eye level with him, and she said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, as if they were simply continuing a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. Hey. I knew you had my bear. Oliver's head came up. He turned toward her voice. And he smiled. Lucas Hartwell had been described, at various points in his life, as calculating, ruthless, brilliant, cold, visionary, and difficult. These descriptions had appeared in articles and profiles and, once, in a particularly pointed speech given by a competitor at an industry conference. Lucas had read them all and had not been particularly troubled by any of them. He had been told, once, by a therapist he saw exactly twice, that he had built very effective walls, and that this was simultaneously his greatest professional asset and his greatest personal liability. He had not gone back to the therapist. But standing at the edge of the South Garden, watching Marcus's flashlight illuminate the curve of the dry fountain, watching the small, curled shape of his son come into view, Lucas discovered that whatever walls he had built over 35 years of determined emotional self-sufficiency were absolutely, completely, catastrophically useless in this moment. He ran. For a man in dress shoes on a stone path in the dark, he ran with a total disregard for his own safety that his security team would later mention to each other with a mixture of surprise and respect. He covered the distance between himself and the fountain in seconds, and he dropped to his knees on the stone without feeling it, and he reached into the fountain basin and gathered Oliver into his arms. Oliver, who had been sitting so still, so quietly holding his bear, made a sound. Not a cry, not a call for help. Just a sound, a small particular sound, that was the sound of a child recognizing the exact person he had been waiting for. The sound of a body understanding it is safe now. Lucas pressed his face into Oliver's hair and stayed there. He did not say anything. There were no words for this. Around them, the security team had arrived, and Marcus was making his report, and somewhere a phone was being called back, and the whole apparatus of the estate was recalibrating itself around the news that the emergency was over. But Lucas didn't hear any of it. After a long time, a minute, maybe two, maybe more, he became aware of a small presence still crouched at the edge of the fountain, watching him with large dark eyes. Rosie, still in her yellow duck pajamas, still holding her pink sneakers in her left hand. Her hair was messy from sleep, and her face was very serious, the way children's faces are when they are being careful to appear unimpressed by their own extraordinary achievements. Lucas looked at her. He was not a man who knew what to say to 3-year-olds. He was not a man who had spent much time in the company of children other than his own. He had a whole vocabulary for business, for gratitude expressed in the language of compensation and terms and agreements, but none of it was remotely adequate for this. He looked at this small girl who had come out in the middle of the night in her duck pajamas and her light-up sneakers, and who had found his son when 12 trained professionals couldn't, and who was now watching him with those careful dark eyes. "How did you know?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Rosie considered the question seriously. "I gave him my bear," she said. "It was my daddy's. It always knows where it is." She paused. "I always know where it is." Lucas looked at the blue bear still clutched in Oliver's hands. Oliver, sensing the attention shift, pressed the bear more firmly to his chest. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said. Rosie nodded. "What made you give it to him?" "The bear." "It was your father's. That's important to you. What made you give something that important to someone else?" Rosie thought about this for longer than most adults would have expected a 3-year-old to think about anything. "Because he gets scared in the dark," she said finally. "And the dark is always. For him, it's always." She looked at Oliver, her expression matter-of-fact and ancient at the same time. "I wanted him to have something that was already found, so he could always be found." Lucas was quiet for a very long time. Then, carefully, he reached out and placed his large hand gently on top of Rosie's small head. It was not a gesture he was practiced in. It was a little awkward, a little uncertain, but it was the only thing he had. "Thank you," he said. "For my son." Rosie looked at his hand on her head, then back at his face. "You're welcome," she said, in a tone that was very polite and also slightly suggested that this had all been entirely logical and she wasn't sure what all the fuss was about. Dawn came slowly to the estate, the way dawn comes after long nights, not as a triumphant arrival, but as a gradual, gentle return of the world to itself. Elena was awake before the sun. She had woken at 2 in the morning to find Rosie's side of the bed empty, and the 40 minutes that followed, before Marcus had brought Rosie back, calm and sleepy and carrying her shoes, and explained what had happened, were 40 minutes that Elena would not remember clearly for the rest of her life, because the mind protects itself from certain extremes of terror by refusing to archive them properly. Now she sat at the kitchen table while Cook Maria made coffee and the security team filed in and out, and Rosie sat on Elena's lap eating toast with the serene self-satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she set out to accomplish. "You should not have gone out alone," Elena said, for approximately the 5th time. "I found him," Rosie said, equally for the 5th time, in a tone that treated this as sufficient rebuttal. "You could have woken me. You would have said no." Elena had no response to this, because it was correct. She held her daughter tighter and pressed her mouth to the top of Rosie's head and said nothing and breathed. It was into this scene that Lucas appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30 in the morning, Oliver asleep against his shoulder, the blue bear still gripped in Oliver's fist. Lucas looked like a man who had not slept and who had spent the night conducting an internal accounting of some kind that had left him altered. He looked at Elena and Rosie for a long moment. "I understand your contract ends today," he said. Elena straightened. "Yes. I was going to. I'd like to offer you a new one," Lucas said. "A different one." He paused, as if searching for words in a language he was still learning. "A better one. Better hours. Better accommodation. A salary increase." He looked at Rosie. "A particular provision that Rosie is to be considered for all practical purposes as having permanent and unconditional access to every part of this estate, including Oliver's room, including the kitchen, including, God help us all, the fountain." Cook Maria made a sound that was either a laugh or a sob and turned hastily back to the coffee. Rosie looked up from her toast with an expression of thoughtful evaluation. "Can I keep doing sock sliding in the hallway?" she asked. Lucas blinked. Yes. Okay, Rosie said, and went back to her toast. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She was a careful woman, a woman who had learned, in the years since her husband died, to not hope for things too quickly, to examine generosity for what it might cost her later, to protect herself and her daughter from the particular injury that comes from expecting too much. But she looked at this man standing in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's clothes with his sleeping son against his shoulder, and she understood that something real had happened in this house last night. Not just the finding of a lost child. Something else. Something about what a small girl with a bear had cracked open in a man who had very effective walls. Why? She asked quietly. Lucas appeared to consider several different answers. Then he looked down at Oliver, at the bear still clutched in the small sleeping fist, and he said, "Because your daughter gave my son the most precious thing she owned, so that he could always be found. I'd like to make sure she's always found, too." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the sun was fully up now, filling the garden with ordinary golden light, the kind of light that makes the previous night's darkness seem like it must have belonged to a different world. Birds were starting. Somewhere in the estate, a door opened, and the morning sounds of a house coming back to life began to layer themselves over the silence. Rosie climbed down from her mother's lap, walked across the kitchen, and very carefully patted Lucas's hand where it rested against Oliver's back. It was a small gesture, entirely matter-of-fact. "He likes when you hold him like that," she told Lucas. "He knows it's you by your heartbeat." Lucas looked down at his son's sleeping face. "How do you know that?" he said softly. "He told me," Rosie said. "Not in words, but he told me." Some stories end and leave nothing behind. The moment passes, the people move on, the details fade, and what seemed significant at the time turns out to have been ordinary after all. This was not that kind of story. 3 years later, Oliver Hartwell was 5 years old and attending a school for visually impaired children 40 minutes from the estate. He was a serious, perceptive child who had strong opinions about music and a remarkable memory for voices, and who could navigate his school corridors with a confidence that regularly astonished his teachers. He had friends. He had preferences. He had, in the particular way of children who learn to rely on their other senses, a quality of attention that the adults around him sometimes found humbling. He still had the blue bear. It lived on his bookshelf, in a specific spot that he always knew exactly, and sometimes in the evenings he would take it down and hold it, not the way young children hold stuffed animals, but carefully, with a particular respect, the way you hold something that belongs partly to someone else's history and has been trusted to you. Rosie was 6, in 1st grade, with the same dark eyes and the same stubborn jaw and opinions that had, if anything, multiplied and intensified with age. She and Oliver had been best friends for 3 years in the way that children who have known each other before they knew much else can be friends, easily, without the architecture of courtship or the negotiation of terms, simply and completely. She still described the world to him. The descriptions had grown more sophisticated, though her fundamental method remained the same, translating the visible into the sensory, finding equivalents in texture and temperature and smell. Today there were clouds like torn paper, she told him once, sitting on his bed after school. Not white paper, like the soft kind. Brown paper like bags. Low clouds. The sky looked like it was thinking about something. Oliver turned this over, his head tilted. "Did it rain?" he asked. "Not yet," Rosie said. But it wanted to. Elena had taken the new contract, and she had stayed, and the estate had quietly reorganized itself around the reality of their presence in a way that felt, after a while, not like an arrangement, but simply like how things were. Elena ran the household with the same confidence she always had, and gradually, slowly, in the careful way that was natural to her, She became someone that Lucas occasionally sat across from at the kitchen table in the early morning and had a real conversation with, not the professional, transactional conversations of employer and employee, but the other kind, the kind that starts with the mundane and ends up somewhere neither person expected. Lucas had changed. Not dramatically. People do not change dramatically, whatever stories say. He had not undergone a transformation. He was still a man of formidable focus and high expectations and more emotional difficulty than was entirely convenient. But there were differences. He took more mornings off. He was present at dinner in a way he had not always been. He had gone back to the therapist, a different one, and stayed longer than twice. And sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on the floor of Oliver's room, because Oliver spent time on the floor, learning his world through touch, and he would be simply present, not doing anything, not problem-solving, not managing an outcome, just there in the room with his son, which was a thing that could not be optimized but only inhabited. The blue bear remained on the shelf. It had never been offered back, and Rosie had never asked for it. This was not because she no longer cared for it, she did. She thought about her father when she saw it, and that thought was not sadness, but something more complicated and more gentle, the feeling of being connected across a distance. She left it with Oliver because she had said it was for always, and she meant what she said. But sometimes, on evenings when she and Oliver sat in his room, and she was describing the world to him, she would glance at the shelf where the bear sat in its place, and she would feel it there the way she always had, present, located, found. And she would feel her father there too. Not in a mystical way, not in a way she would have tried to explain to anyone. Just in the way that love persists in the objects it inhabits, the way a smell can bring back a whole world, the way a specific weight in the hand can mean safety. She had given Oliver a way to be found. She had not expected it to find her too. Outside, it had finally started to rain. In a room 2 floors up, a 5-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl sat on the floor, listening to the sound of it, the particular percussion of water against glass, the deepening of the air, the smell of earth receiving what the sky had been holding. Oliver tilted his head. "What color's rain?" he asked. Rosie thought about it. "Gray," she said, "but the good kind of gray. Like a blanket. Like something covering you up to keep you warm." Oliver nodded, slowly. "I like that color," he said. And Rosie smiled. "Me too," she said. "Me too." Before you go, I just want to say thank you for being part of this channel. If these stories bring you comfort, inspiration, or simply brighten your day, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Your support helps me continue creating more heartfelt stories for this wonderful community, and truly, every bit of support means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.